Hello and welcome to a special bonus episode of Tales from the Oval. My name's Jon Surtees, and I'm usually joined by Tom Holland, host of The Rest is History and respected historian in many areas. But we've just finished recording an episode about the Oval at War, which featured his brother James, who is himself an incredibly respected historian, podcaster, worldwide expert on the Second World War. And we just wanted to record a special episode here. Paying tribute to two of the great figures of Surrey County Cricket Club from the second half of the 20th century, who, although they were not necessarily associated with the club during the war, are incredible figures in their own right for those that know about the Second World War. And we just wanted to tell their stories and talk a little bit about what they achieved, James. The first person I wanted to ask you to speak about is Lord Tedder. So he was from a Surrey perspective, the president of the club from 1953 until 1958. His picture hangs outside of the committee room. Tell us a little bit about Tedder and his war and his history, his background.
Well, Tedder is one of the great commanders, Allied commanders of the Second World War. He's an airman, and he's a pilot in the First World War and stays in the RAF and goes up through the ranks. And he is a pioneering commander during his time in the Middle East. He becomes commander in chief of the RAF in the Middle East in 1941, and oversees an absolute transformation of air power. From the Allied point of view. So the start of the war, the way the RS divided is into commands. So you've got fighter command, which is all the Spitfires and Hurricanes defending Britain in the Battle of Britain. You've got bomber command, and that's Bomber Harris and all the rest of it, and going off and destroying cities, etc. You've got coastal command, which is protecting the coast and doing research and mining operations on enemy-held ports and so on. And then you've got training command, which is obviously the training of a bit. What you haven't got, though, is what's called a tactical air force, what we would know as considered to be close air support. And this is this idea that you're using hot air power to support what's going on the ground. And this is very much the way the German force, the Luftwaffe, kind of grows up, emerges in the 1930s as an air power which is there directly to support the ground forces. And one of the reasons why the Luftwaffe doesn't do very well in the Battle of Britain is because it's then operating as a strategic air force, completely on its own, independently of any ground forces. And it's not really equipped for that. And it sort of cocks it up, frankly. But Tedder takes this to another level in 1941-42. With a bunch of sort of subordinate commanders who are similarly like-minded and enlightened. And when the Americans join in the war on the ground, with the invasion of Northwest Africa in November 1942, they also come with plenty of air power as well. And they're really, really into it, and they want to learn it. And there's this group of Allied air commanders, people like Tui Spots, who's American, Mary Cunningham, who's Arthur Cunningham, rather. He's always known as Mary. He's actually the son of an Australian Test cricketer who ends up in prison in the early part of the 20th century, as it happens, and then settles in New Zealand, and he gets called Mary Cunningham, which then becomes Mary Cunningham. So he's always known as Mary, and it's a complete misnomer because he's an incredibly butch, tough, kind of ungirly kind of figure, and he's completely brilliant. Yeah. But there's all these guys like that. But the kind of master of ceremonies, the guy who's kind of overseeing all this, is Tedder. And air power becomes absolutely central to the way the Western Allies want to fight their war and ultimately win their war as well. And so he's an incredibly important pioneering commander. He's very popular. He's liked by pretty much everybody. He has a kind of big spat with Montgomery, but that's by the by, and he's certainly not alone on that front. When it comes to planning Operation Overlord, which of course is D-Day, which we've just had gone through the 80th anniversary of that this summer, the Supreme Allied Commander is appointed, and it's General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American. But he needs a deputy, and his deputy is Tedder. So, he's number 2 in terms of commanders for the whole of the Northwest European campaign from D-Day right through to the end of the war. And it is Tedder who is the Western Allied representative at the Soviet surrender ceremony when the Germans surrendered to the Soviets on the 9th of May. So the day after RVE
Wow.
Day. So he's there then. So he's a super big cheese. He's incredibly talented. He's got a lifelong passion for cricket, and in his first summer is when the Ashes coming on, when he's president of Surrey, and he actually has quite a
Yeah.
strong connection to Australia because his wife, who he absolutely adored, they were complete soulmates, was Australian, but very tragically was killed in the Middle East in a plane crash in 1942, for which he never really recovered. Um, but having retired, he was sort of twiddling his thumbs. He was a Surrey man. He kind of lived in Surrey, loved his cricket, and it was Sir Walter Monckton who was the Conservative Minister for Labour in Churchill's second government. He was retiring as the president of Surrey, and wondered whether Tedder might like to take over. And he said, it's not a shoo-in because, it has to go to a vote, but it kind of is a shoo-in because if it's you, no one's going to
Yeah.
not vote for you. And he held the post
Yeah.
for 5 years. I mean, it's
At
really
an
interesting
amazing
because
time
when
as well.
an amazing time, and
So
when you're
it's
thinking about all these guys that you're thinking about these commanders from the Second World War, there are obviously figures that everyone knows about. Everyone's heard of Monty, everyone's heard of Eisenhower, everyone's heard of Patton. If you've got even the slightest bit of interest in the Second World War, quite a few people have heard of Slim and the 14th Army in Burma and all the rest of it. Very few
mm,
people have heard of Tedder, and yet
mm.
at the time he was an absolute household name. I mean, in terms of kudos, this is about as big as it gets, really.
Well, there's two things on that for me. One of the things extraordinary, from my perspective, when I think about the 1950s and cricket, the 1950s, I think about that Surrey team of the Surridge team, and then becoming the May team, and those incredible players, the Bedsers and Lachlan Laker and Peter Loader, and as I say, Surridge and May themselves, and people think about how do they do this? How do they win so successfully, so many times, so consecutively? How do they do this? And there's so many reasons, but also people I don't think realise that just upstairs in the dressing room, you've got this chap, you've got Arthur Tedder, who is a national hero, and the man who was second in command on the Western Front, and just he. I would assume was relatively close with Surridge and May, and certainly
Mm-hmm.
I can't imagine he was backward in offering advice when he thought it might be handy, and he's a real kind of X factor to think about his presence in this era.
Yeah, he really
And
is. He really is X Factor, and he was Marshal of the Air Force, Lord Tedder. So that makes
yeah,
him in
yeah,
Army rank a Field Marshal. That you
right,
can't get higher than that. That is a 5-star general in modern
wow,
parlance. He's ennobled for what he's done. I mean, he is absolutely top of the tree. He's an incredibly good bloke. I mean, he's very straightforward, very decent guy, incredibly bright, very kind of clear thinking. Never sort of really went grey. So he's one of these people that looked quite sort of evergreen. He sat there kind of saying
wow,
he was quite sort of lean and trim and tidy, never had a moustache or anything like that. He was always clean shaven.
yeah,
Had quite a sort of modern looking face. It's quite interesting. Always smoked a pipe, very straight kind of pipe. That was his kind of, that was his
that was his
vice.
thing.
And
Wow,
just an all-round amazing person, and a
he sounds
completely brilliant and enlightened air commander at a time where being a pioneer had a really huge impact on the way the Western Allies fought their war.
Yeah, and sounds like a sort of an amazing chap to hang out with the ultimate Brill Cream Boy, Peter Barker, Howard May as well. They
Of
sound like
course,
quite the
absolutely.
pair.
Yeah,
I suppose
yeah,
that the
yeah.
one other thing quickly that fascinated me was you talked, and we don't need to go into huge detail here. I think there are other podcasts such as your own that can be the venue for that detail. But you said there was a rivalry there with Montgomery, which he wasn't alone with. Montgomery, of course, also famously associated with the Oval, born over the road in the White
Yes.
House. If you
Hmm.
exit the Hobbs Gate and you see the white building with the blue plaque on the side of the building, that's Monty's blue plaque right there to commemorate. He was the son of the vicar of St Mark's Church back when that building was the vicarage for St Mark's Church. And I think famously Monty, no stranger to the Oval himself. He popped over the road, popped in a fair bit. There was I understand that he gave, this is wonderful. I think so I'm no expert on Monty, but you can get an idea of his character from this story. He once presented Jim Laker with a banknote signed by himself as a reward for being a brilliant cricketer. it's just the idea. Here we go. This is, I want to give you this signed by me to congratulate you for an extraordinary feat. Was
Monty's a great
quite
man.
something.
He was a great man. He was a brilliant commander, and it's right that he's venerated. And there's been his detractors over the years. He was a very difficult, kind of prickly figure, and he certainly hadn't been to charm school or anything like that. I mean, you would never call Monty a diplomat, but I think it's important to kind of understand that unattractive character traits doesn't mean to say that means you're a bad general. I mean, the two things don't go
Sure.
hand in hand at all.
No, of course, of course.
And also, all his talks and all his speeches are always littered with cricketing references. He's always hitting Rommel for six, and
Right.
taking wickets and hitting boundaries and
Mm.
getting a century off the enemy and all this kind of stuff. I mean, all his pep talks
Yeah.
are littered with cricketing references.
But the idea of maybe sort of putting to bed one of the bigger rivalries of the Second World War on the terrace in front of the committee room whilst watching Surrey win the championship in the 1950s is quite appeals to my kind of romantic side, I think.
Well, you and me the same.
Yeah, yeah. Look, the other chap I wanted to talk to you about again is a fellow called George Edwards.
Yep.
Now George was president of Surrey in the 1970s, I think 1979. Much younger than Tedder. Therefore, obviously far less senior in the Second World War. But he did serve. He was an aeronautical engineer, I believe, and served in the Barnes-Wallis team. So
Well, he
James,
was
tell us a
the
little
he's
bit about
the
that.
yeah. So he's the experimental manager at Vickers Aviation in the first part of the
What a
war.
job title!
Yeah, it's a hell of a job title. So he is the kind
Yeah.
of sort of he's a kind of in-house boffin for Vickers Aviation. So Vickers is this huge armaments company that makes it's Vickers Armstrong. They make tanks, they make artillery pieces, but they also make aircraft. Vickers has bought out Supermarine, which makes the Spitfire. So ultimately, they make the Spitfire as well, but they also make the Vickers Wellington and various others,
Mm.
and even one of the V bombers post-war. So they're a really big company, and Barnes Wallis is the deputy chief assistant chief designer. He's not the chief designer, but he's a deputy, and so that allows him a bit of latitude to go and sort of think about other things. So even before the war, he's thinking of all sorts of ways in which they can sort of crush the industrial infrastructure of Nazi Germany. And the bouncing bomb, the original of the idea of the bouncing bomb is to attack ships. The original design of it was aimed
Ah,
to sink the Tirpitz in its
right.
fjord up in Norway. Because the problem
Yeah.
with that is you can't get into it because it's got this surrounded by anti-aircraft guns, and you've got the narrow sides of the fjord, which makes it from a flying point of view, it makes it very, very dangerous. The other thing is they've
Mm.
got these sort of vertical torpedo nets strung across the fjord, so you can't sneak in with a submarine because the torpedo will get it. But the
Mm.
only way to do it is to fly in, drop a bomb. So the plane then pulls out, but the bomb bounces over the torpedo nets, hits the side of the ship,
Oh.
rolls down the side of it, then explodes and sinks it. Then they realize that they can
Wow.
do this against sort of vast dams in to the kind of to the east of the Ruhr industrial heartland of Western Germany. So that's where that comes from. But Barnes Wallis is still grappling with the basic designs of this bouncing bomb. When George Edwards, who as the Vickers experimental manager and a very, very keen cricketer, says to him, what you need to create a kind of backspin on this. And this is because Edwards is a very keen spin bowler.
No.
And so he says, look, why don't you try and create some backspin on it? Then you'll find that the it'll bounce a skim across the water
Will alter.
that much better. So they are
Wow.
practicing with cricket balls on this.
So
And then
it's
they do
so
some
so it's
experiments on Silvermere Lake, which is just to the east of Cobham. And, and Wallace and Edwards and his secretary, Amy Gentry, who's a former ladies rowing champion, Amy Gentry kind of rows them out, and they kind of do all these they do this flicking balls onto the
um
surface of the Silvermere Lake.
the
And he
Surrey
realizes that
Men.
George Edwards is absolutely right. So it's I mean, I think it's really interesting that obviously the concept of the bouncing bomb, which actually isn't a bomb, it's a depth charge. So the idea is that it sinks to a certain degree, then the pressure of the water above it helps detonate it, or helps magnify the explosive effect of the
Yeah.
detonation, which is timed to go off at a certain time. Um, But it's important to understand that while the concept of it is absolutely Barnes Wallis, there are a host of bit players and fairly large players in this whole story, of which George Edwards, the cricket nut boffin at Vickers Aviation, is plays a very, very important part.
Extraordinary. Well, George Edwards, to I mean, I say complete his story. There is so much more to him than this. But he, I think, leaves the military after the Second World War and becomes a civil aviator. Joins, joins civil aviation company, and ultimately his aviation career peaks as he's the chief executive of the British half of the team that develops the Concorde.
Yep.
So he, continued on an upward trajectory. He was also a sufficiently talented watercolorist to be exhibited at the Royal Academy, and
I
as
didn't know
a
that. That's amazing.
that's amazing, and one of the great men of Guildford Cricket Club. I think is very very fondly remembered there for a number of incredible things that he's done for Guildford Cricket Club.
Well,
But
yes. Well, Vickers
yeah,
Aviation is based at Weybridge,
right,
and
yeah,
so that um, near the old race circuit, the motor racing circuit there. So,
right, okay.
and all the offices are still there. You can go and visit Barnes Wallis's office there if you go there in the museum and things. It's absolutely amazing.
I think I'm going to have to do that.
Yeah, it's great.
James, thank you.
It's motor racing and aviation all in one place.
Oh, what more can a boy want for a day out? My word.
Exactly.
Look, James, thank you so much. I think it's really interesting. Just as a little sort of side note to the story we're telling here. I think it's almost offensive to you call people like Tedder and Edward side notes, but the podcast that Tom and I are doing, hopefully people are enjoying listening to them as much as we're enjoying making them. But to have a man of your expertise on, I really wanted to tell the story of those two individuals because I think that
They're
they're
worth
people
telling.
the club are
They're worth telling.
they're very worth telling, and they're people I think the club is rightly proud to have such deep associations with both of them. So James, look, thank you so much for your time and just making us a little bit more educated on some of the people that have been knocking around this great place over the years.
Not only is it a pleasure, it's an honour too, John.